changes in gene pools, part of our evolution of populations unit. So a gene pool is the total number of gene variations that account for different traits within a species. You guys have learned about this before. You've learned about alleles. Remember your big B's and little b's and things like that. Remember, some alleles are dominant and some alleles are recessive. Remember, if you have at least one dominant allele, then that's the trait that's going to show up in the gene pool. So we've talked about how species have genetic variations within individuals, and that allows them to have genetic diversity within a population. Genetic diversity is going to be an advantage in a population because if something happens to that population, it's going to allow some of those organisms to survive because they have some adaptation that's better than the other individuals. So if a species has a large gene pool, it has greater diversity and therefore is more likely to survive some kind of event that happens. So we have an example here. It says a population of brown foxes migrates north to an area that gets snowfall for most of the winter. Some of the foxes have a genetic variation that causes their fur to turn white in the winter, but to remain brown for the summer. The foxes that do not have this genetic variation are brown throughout the year. How might natural selection affect the gene pool of these foxes? So we've had examples like this before. We know that the ones that turn white in the winter are better camouflaged than the ones that remain brown, so they're going to have a better chance of survival. So natural selection is going to cause more white foxes to become more prevalent in the population over time. So remember, natural selection, the organism itself is not choosing what happens to it. Natural selection is choosing the traits that are already there. Those traits are either there naturally or from mutations that occur. So scientists believe that random mutations are responsible for creating the variety of life that we have because it allows certain organisms to survive and gives them benefits over other organisms. So sexual selection is where one sex chooses a mate. Normally in nature, it's the female that gets to choose the mate. And if you've watched our videos with the birds of paradise, like they're shown in the picture, we've seen that the male has to do some sort of exotic dance or puts on a show or has just crazy weird feathers and other body traits that it's trying to show off and get that female to choose him. So these are called sexual selection, and desired traits are being favored over undesirable traits. So the male that does the craziest dance or has the prettiest feathers is going to be selected over the other ones. As humans, we use what's called artificial selection when we breed animals, particularly dogs. We know that dogs evolved from wolves, and all of the dogs that we presently have been sculpted by humans. This is called selective breeding, and it's called artificial because it's not allowing nature to take its course. If nature took its course, we'd probably just still have wolves. But we pick the traits that we like, and therefore the undesirable traits are going to be eventually removed from the gene pool, and the desirable traits are going to be kept and then passed on to the offspring of those dogs. One thing we've seen a lot of lately is what is called antibiotic and pesticide resistance. This is an example of evolution happening in the short term. One of the arguments that people have against evolution is that you can't see it happening in real time because it takes so long. But this is an example of where you can see it happening. We've been using antibiotics for a while, and we've noticed that a lot of bacteria are mutating, and they are becoming resistant to a lot of the antibiotics that we have, meaning the antibiotic no longer works against that bacteria and does not kill that bacteria. Same thing with insects becoming resistant to pesticides. Farmers that are using pesticides to get insects off of their plants have noticed that they have to keep changing their pesticide, trying different pesticides, or trying even stronger pesticides. This becomes a problem because eventually we're going to get to the point where we don't have anything that works against certain bacteria or certain pesticides, and we have to just keep changing them, potentially making them more dangerous for humans and other living things in the environment. So once an organism acquires a mutation that allows it to survive, that is natural selection taking place very quickly. Bacteria reproduce very, very quickly, very often. You can go from one bacteria to millions of bacteria very quickly, and that becomes a problem if they're passing on that resistance to their offspring. That's why when you have antibiotics, you always want to finish your course of antibiotics. Your doctor has probably told you that, because what happens is the first couple of days you kill the weaker bacteria, right? But if you don't finish it, you're left with the stronger bacteria, and those are the ones that get to reproduce. So you really want to finish your antibiotics, even if you feel better, just to make sure you get all the bacteria that are there. Okay, same thing if you're a farmer and you're trying to get rid of pests on your plants. So we have an example. We have a soybean crop was treated with a pesticide to reduce crop damage from a bean leaf beetle infestation. Upon initial treatment, the beetle population was dramatically reduced. However, a few survivors remained. After repeated treatments, the pesticide was found to be ineffective in controlling the bean leaf beetle population. See the illustration below. Why do pesticide treatments become ineffective? Basically, because, like I said, it kills the weaker beetles. The stronger beetles are going to be the ones that survive. Here's some that have survived here, okay, and they're resistant, and they're going to make beetle babies, and those beetle babies are going to be resistant. Okay, so that's how resistant ends up happening. And like I said, that's an evolution that you can see in the short term. All right, next topic is genetic diversity and gene flow. So I already mentioned the importance of genetic diversity. It allows a species to adapt to a different environment in case something happens in that environment, a drought, famine, a disease, something like that. Some organisms are going to be resistant and able to survive, and those are the ones that are going to pass on their traits. So species that have high rates of mutations or large gene pools to begin with are better able to survive environmental changes. So if you have a very small gene pool, you're not going to be able to survive in case something happens, and that species is going to be more vulnerable and may eventually go extinct. So gene flow is just the movement of genes or alleles. Remember, alleles are versions of the gene into or out of a population. So in this picture, you have some green beetles over here. You have some brown beetles over here. But one brown beetle is migrating over to the green population, and that just means that's going to introduce that brown allele to that population and might eventually change the genetics of that population. Genetic drift is a process that changes the gene pool just because of chance. So if you look at your beetle populations here, you have a population that has 6 brown and 3 green. Somebody walks by and steps on 2 of the green. Okay, so that has greatly reduced the population of green individuals in that population. They don't have any other green ones to breed with, and therefore if the green allele is recessive, we don't know what is what, but if that green allele were recessive, there's going to be a greater chance that that green allele might eventually be completely eliminated from that environment. Another term is the bottleneck effect. This is when a population size is dramatically reduced by a disease, a natural disaster, an outbreak, habitat destruction, overhunting, just something disastrous has happened to that population. And it really depends on which members of that population are affected if you're going to see the bottleneck effect. So if there's only a few individuals left, then those individuals are going to rebuild the population, and those individuals are going to pass on their genetics. But remember, it's completely random. Okay, so if you go back here, so like I said, if this population is remaining after a disaster, such as a guy stepping on some of the beetles, okay, then you're going to see mostly brown beetles to continue on, and that's what the bottleneck effect is. If the guy had stepped on all the brown beetles, then you would have seen the green population carry on. So that's the bottleneck effect. Okay, so here you can see it illustrated. You have a bottle of colorful marbles representing the bottleneck effect. So you can see something happens, only a few survive, okay, and that surviving population is going to determine who is left. So example 3 says, a mouse species live on a small island. In this population of mice, an average of 10% are born with large ears. If a hurricane kills 80% of all life on the island, including the mouse population, how might this decrease in the population affect the gene pool? So a couple different things could happen. If 100% of the large-eared mice died in the hurricane, you might no longer have any large-eared mice left, which means small-eared mice are going to completely take over. It says, by chance, some of the genes that were present in the 80% of individuals that died would be lost, and only the genes present in the 20% surviving individuals would remain in the gene pool. So again, it's all due to chance. It really is going to be determined by which individuals survive that dramatic event. So the remaining organisms are going to have a more limited gene pool, and this may favor a different trait that was seen in the original population. So back here with the mice, okay, only 10% are born with large ears. But if it just so happens that all of the small-eared mice are killed in the hurricane, then that's going to favor the large ears, and then they can take over. Okay, so you might eventually see more large-eared mice on that island. Okay. A similar thing that can happen is the founder effect. This is where a small population or a few individuals leave a population and colonize a new area. So think about, the pioneers heading out west or something like that. Whatever genes they bring with them, those are going to be the ones to establish a new population. So again, if all the small-eared mice just happen to go off and leave and go to a different island, then they would be founders of that new population, and they would create that new gene distribution. So down here, I know it's kind of small, but you've got an island here with some beetles. This island had about half and half red beetles versus yellow beetles. If all of the beetles that leave happen to be red and end up on this new island, then all of the beetles on the new island will eventually be red, especially if red is the dominant trait. So disease is something that can greatly affect natural selection. There's different types of disease agents, bacteria, fungi, viruses, even chemicals that can cause disease. The survival of the fittest that we've been talking about is going to apply in being able to fight and survive diseases, because some people have better immune systems. Some people are naturally more resistant to diseases. So when you have an entire population exposed to a disease, those that are going to survive are going to be the ones that pass their genes to future generations. And that's going to be beneficial, because then those future generations will have an advantage in that they're more resistant to the disease. So you have an example 1, you have a fungus is introduced to a pine forest, and many pines die due to disease caused by the fungus. Some of the trees, however, are resistant to the disease and survive. The surviving trees reproduce. How does natural selection affect the traits of the newly reproduced trees? Well, it's going to have the traits of the ones that survived. Example 2, you have a bacteria culture is started from a single bacterium. After treating the culture with a disinfectant chemical, only 2% of the culture survives. If the culture is left to repopulate, how will it likely respond to future disinfectant treatment with the same chemical? Well, this is where we have an example of resistance. So this is a reason why you don't want to over sanitize your hands. I know right now there's a big influence on using hand sanitizer a lot, washing your hands a lot. But we know that the 2% that survives, these are the strong bacteria, and they're going to make more strong bacteria. So that Germ-X is not going to be as effective as it normally would be if you allow the strong to survive. All right, and that's where we're going to stop for the day. I hope this is helpful as you're going through your notes. If you have any questions, please write them down, ask them, send me an email, get on Google Classroom, or wait till you come back to school and ask about it. Thanks. Bye.